So I've had a few questions here recently from clients, and I just wanted to talk for just a couple minutes here about the importance of giving what I would call a fair shake to your investments and strategy. It's really important when we're measuring our investments performance, obviously to measure it over a meaningful time period. I think we all know, even though we may want to measure it over a shorter period of time, but I think we all realize if we've been investing for any time that 1 month or 3 month or even 1 year is probably not an adequate time frame to really gauge how an investment's doing. In reality, we should be measuring performance of investment strategies or managers based on a full market cycle. That is a boom period, a downturn period, maybe a plateau. It's really important to analyze the performance and how it's doing over a longer period of time. One of the other questions I've got a lot here recently is, what benchmark, what do we use to compare our portfolio against? And I think our common reaction of what we're trained and what we see in the news and media is we just compare our investment portfolio to how is the S&P 500 doing. So, of course, that's an index that measures the 500 largest companies, and it's assuming for all practical purposes that you're 100% invested in the market. Now, obviously, if we peel that back and we look at it, we would realize pretty quick that if we're a retired client, we're probably not comparing apples to apples. A retired investor or even a investor with 10 years to go till retirement probably isn't putting all of their money in the market, so it's probably not a fair comparison. There's things to think about when you're comparing your portfolio on the subject of benchmarks. So if you have a portfolio that's not all invested in the market, obviously you wouldn't be comparing that to the S&P. Maybe you have a portfolio that's not invested in the market, or maybe it's only half invested in the market. There may be other benchmarks that are appropriate to measure that against. It's just important, and if you need any help with that or determining that, when we run your client portfolio reporting, we are comparing it to the closest benchmark that matches your portfolio. And we can talk about that more. There's also reasons why in the short term, your strategy may not completely match the benchmark. Maybe you own quite a bit of international and you're comparing it to the S&P that's all US. Maybe you own quite a few bonds in the portfolio. Obviously, that's not a good comparison to an all equity index like the S&P 500. Maybe you have strategy specific investments where maybe that manager is raising cash in the short term. So maybe it doesn't look so good in 1, 2, or 3 months because you have money sitting in cash, and maybe the manager got out of a few investments a little bit early, but maybe in a year or two that performance will look totally different because they were buying when the market was down. Also, perhaps you own a manager that favors certain sectors over other sectors during which their economic outlook of the next 6 to 12 months, maybe they're looking at that and they're making adjustments based on sectors, and maybe they've exited a sector and maybe they were a few months early on their call, and maybe that doesn't look so smart right now, but maybe in a year or two that looks really smart when it's compared to the benchmark at a later date over a longer period of time. Also, one of the risks that we run up against is comparing one manager that we've hired to possibly another manager. And what I mean by that is maybe we've hired a manager that specializes in owning dividend, conservative, large U.S. companies that maybe not only pay dividends but are increasing dividends. And maybe the other manager that we own specializes in a niche of owning growth type investments that maybe are growing their revenue at a much faster pace. Maybe we're comparing those two, and in a certain market environment, one's going to be in favor a lot more than the other. So again, comparing those two managers during the same time period and not a full market cycle for both of them is not a very accurate description of the long-term success and viability of either one of those managers. The last example I would give is maybe we own a strategy where a manager is what we call tax aware. They're looking at investments that aren't all about just the bottom line return, but they're looking for efficiencies in the portfolio to help minimize tax consequences in a portfolio. Perhaps the return over a certain period of time is less than its comparable index or the S&P 500 or whatever that we're looking at there. But perhaps when you factor in the tax savings of an investment like that, maybe the adjusted return is very comparable and very, very adequate. So there's just a whole number of things to look at. Bottom line, it's very important to make sure you're comparing apples to apples, not only comparing when it comes to comparing your investments or your strategies to certain indexes, but also when evaluating managers against other managers, understanding what each one of those managers or strategies are and how they operate to make sure we're getting a clear understanding over a full market cycle of what's going on. Again, if you have questions on how to compare to benchmarks, how to look at one manager versus another to understand what's going on in any certain situation, we're glad to always sit down and go over those with you and let you know what's going on.